This is Greg Gust with the National Weather Service out of Grand Forks, North Dakota, with the 2017 Spring Flood Outlook. This issued on the 2nd of March 2017. This is for the Red River and Devils Lake Basin. And in brief, the South Basin does still have a risk that is near normal for spring flooding, largely because of the risk of additional snow or rain that might occur. In the North Basin, the overall flood risk has been slightly lowered, but it is still quite high in the far northern valley, highest in the Devils Lake Basin and the northeast North Dakota tributaries. Looking closer into the southern basin, the reason why the flood risk is still at least minor, first of all, the old snowpack is gone. Residual runoff, however, remains in the river systems, and there is still the risk of heavy spring snow or rain in the area. The topsoil is still quite wet and frozen, so any precipitation should produce runoff. The outlook period does now extend into early June, so there is also the enhanced risk for thunderstorm activity from April into May. And overall, the risk for thunderstorms is above normal throughout the central plains and into the northern plains this spring season. The flood risk in general is very near normal now from Grand Forks south into the headwaters of the Red River Basin. In the north part of the basin, significant snowpack still remains, and most of the melt or runoff that has occurred still sits in the field, in the snowpack, on the landscape, or in the ditch network. With that, also more spring snow and rain is quite likely in this area. There's very deep and very saturated soils, and of course there's still frozen ground throughout the area. This outlook period does extend again into early June, where the risk of thunderstorms is currently above normal for much of the area, and the flood risk is therefore quite high. Looking at our snowpack, we've seen a significant reduction in the last couple of weeks, but we still have 10 to 20 inches of dense and wet snow extending across the Devils Lake Basin, northward of Grafton, Hallock area, and up toward Roseau. Southward from there, we still have a couple 2 to 10 inches of dense wet snow remaining on the landscape, north of Cooperstown to Oslo to Thief River line. And then southward of there, from Valley City, Grand Forks, Boston areas, and points south, there are still trace amounts of snowpack remaining. Within that snowpack, of course, the water content is very high where there still is snowpack. Again, very little in the central and southern parts of the basin, but much of the snow that has melted in those locations, that moisture is now in the river system, in the tributaries, and some of that has moved into the Red River as well. Our soil moistures throughout the area are still quite high. In the north, the soil moisture is still at the 90th to 99th percentile, and very deep wet soils as mentioned, and still largely snow covered. In the southern part of the basin, now there's extensive bare soil, and with that there's also drier, deep soil profiles in that area. So there is some absorptive capacity, so that's been reduced to an 80th to 90th percentile in the southern basin. Why so wet in the north? This graphic shows the amount of above normal precipitation last summer and into early fall, from May 1st into the end of September, and 8 to 14 inches above normal precipitation up in northeast North Dakota to far northwest Minnesota. So again, very deep wet soils. A lot of that moisture is still in the landscape and still available for runoff. And of course, it's also snow covered right now. Since October 1st and into March 1st, still half an inch to an inch, pushing an inch and a half above normal in the North Basin. But in the South Basin, that's 2 to 3 inches above normal precipitation during this period. Much of that again as rain or freezing rain early in the winter. So that's very wet topsoil layer. In February, throughout February now, much of the precipitation has been very near long-term normals, whereas the temperatures have been much above normal. So with that, in the northern part of the basin, 3 to 7 degrees above normal, making the 14th warmest February in the Grand Forks area. Some 6 to 10 degrees above normal down in the southern part of the basin. So the near record thaw processes that occurred in February, especially across the southern and central parts of the basin, pretty much eliminated the snowpack up until this time. It just shows, again, much of the area at the 90th or higher percentile of base stream flows. And that is similar to wet years like the winter of 2010-2011. Our frost depths vary considerably across the area, from 8 to 20 inches across northeast North Dakota to far northwest Minnesota. So the flood categories again, basically minor flood risk through the central and southern part of the basin, moderate to major in the north and across the Devils Lake Basin. Looking at the far south Fargo, so we'd expect minor, possibly low end to moderate flooding in many of the southern basins still to come. The Red River, of course, at Fargo, and this is a current hydrograph showing the flow that is receding from recent runoff. So that's the blue line that is coming down from 20 feet, a drop below minor flood stage and action stage early this morning. And with warm up coming later next week, we could see a rise back into the action stage near minor flooding as additional runoff occurs. I should point out, from Fargo north, as we get Halstead, Grand Forks, and up into Oslo, the Red River is still frozen and still iced over. So the river has been rising, and that water pushing the ice up and breaking, but now with very cold temperatures these last few days, that ice has restructured and is still well in place across the top of the river. Our expectation is for moderate to low-end major flooding as you push from Grand Forks into the Oslo area. And you can see that even at the 50% point, that is just a bit above normal type of flooding for this area. And the inset shows the Red River at Oslo that did peak near 27.77 feet a couple of days ago and is now receding below that. It should be below minor flood stage early in the coming week. Looking over at the North Dakota tributaries, the far northeast North Dakota tributaries, this is the Park River and Grafton, where there's a huge amount of runoff potential. And with that, a risk of major flooding to record flooding expected there. There's a 50% risk of reaching 17.2 feet. The inset shows that during the recent warm-up, there's been virtually no runoff in the Park River system yet through Grafton. Up on the Pembina River at Netchie, similar type of situation where we'd expect major flooding there, not quite pushing to flood of record. It pretty much flat lines around 21.5 feet, and from that point starts to spill out and move around Netchie, but still a major flood risk expected up there. And at this point, little to no runoff into the Pembina River itself. Over on the Minnesota side, in far northwest Minnesota, the Two River system coming into Hallock, moderate to major flooding is expected there. This is actually a slight decrease from 2 weeks ago, so we're looking more at the top end of the moderate scale. The inset shows just a little bit of runoff that has occurred in there and now is tapering down. So there has been a little bit of runoff from some of those tributaries. But all of that coming in now into the main stem red and up in the Red River up to Pembina at the border. Major flooding expected up there. A 50% risk for reaching 50.8 feet. And that is in the low end major category. That has actually come down a bit from 2 weeks ago, where we were looking at a 50% risk of reaching 51.5 feet. So just a slight reduction due to decreased flows expected on the main stem red itself and a little bit less coming out of northwest Minnesota. Moving over to the Devils Lake at Creel Bay, again, major flooding still expected there. Similar type of runoffs expected that we saw in 2009 and 2011. But overall, we are expecting that 50% chance of reaching 1,453.6 feet at Devils Lake. And there still is a 18% risk of exceeding the flood of record. This graphic shows some of the same conditions in a different format. So we would expect to see significant runoff start to occur across the Devils Lake Basin throughout April and into May, with very sharp increases going into the lake from that late April into May period, and then peaking in the lake around the early to middle part of June. The most likely range now has shifted down a little bit, with the top of that being just under the flood of record. It is still possible that we could meet or exceed that flood of record. There's a 10% risk of getting up to 1,454.6 feet. So looking at that flood risk and thinking about upcoming conditions, we do have an expectation for a small amount of precipitation across the basin over the next 7 days, but just 1/10 of an inch or less of moisture and snowfall here expected on Friday, and then trace rain or snow again possible next week. Stronger, wetter systems will be impacting the Pacific Northwest, and then also coming up from the southern plains and into the Ohio Valley, but largely bypassing the Red River Basin. We do expect in the 8 to 14 day outlook period, and that's from March 9th into the 15th, relatively mild and somewhat snowy or rainy conditions. And thus the Climate Prediction Center has updated their March outlook in general to call for near or slightly above normal temperatures for the area, with still that slight wet signal persisting across the northern parts of the basin. And then from March into April and May, that near to slightly above normal temperatures and near to slightly above normal precipitation persisting. The risk again in the southern basin is down a bit, but is still very near long-term normals. The risk in the far northern part of the basin and Devils Lake Basin is still quite high. We do expect the possibility for an update on or around the 24th of March, should there still be snow to contend with. This has been Greg Gust for the National Weather Service in Grand Forks.